Hello, thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to be with you for this webinar that we wanted to pull together so that we could share some ideas and thoughts around how organizations can position themselves during times of crisis. We're all in an unprecedented time with the COVID-19 situation. And as we think about organizational transformations, we might be thinking, well, that's pretty low on the priority list. But the interesting thing is, it's not. Organizations are now in a very tumultuous period. Many of us work in those companies and are trying to figure out how to continue to move things forward. And so today, we want to spend a few minutes sharing some foundational principles that we think can help any executive team or practitioner help their organization through some of these difficult times. Just a little bit of context and background. AlignOrg Solutions has been around for quite a while, 25 plus years, and we really help organizations specialize in how they set and pursue a differentiated marketplace strategy, how to diagnose the capabilities of their organization, to realign and redesign their organizations, and how to effectuate change throughout an organization to actually achieve improved results. When we do our work with organizations, most of our work, 80% of it or more, is actually doing transformation projects, helping organizations rethink how they're going to go to market and win. The other 20% of what we do is about helping build capabilities amongst practitioners and executives so that they're in a position to ask the right questions and have some of the frameworks and tools that can help them be effective. Now today, as we go through our webinar, I may allude to a few stories and examples that come from lots of different organizations. Many of these we read about in the paper, or no longer the paper, I guess online, and we hear stories about how they're trying to creatively attack their marketplace and how they're trying to position themselves to be successful. And as we learn from and experience stories from these different organizations, we're in a better spot to think about how might these implications apply for my organization. So I'm excited today to dive in. There's sort of four key objectives that we want to cover. The first is, why should organizations continue critical work like an organization transformation or an organization redesign during a time of crisis? Shouldn't we put everything on hold and just wait until things kind of settle out, and then we can all come back and figure out what to do next? Second question we want to explore is, how can organization design help your company overcome strategic challenges, even some that you might be facing now? The third topic that we want to touch on is, what are some of the key building blocks to ensure that strategic organization design helps your company respond and respond well during times of crises? And then finally, we want to touch on how can you advance your organization alignment and transformation now, if you decided that you want to pursue some changes. Now, we're all well aware of the devastating impact that COVID-19 is having, not just in the United States, but around the world. The numbers in the United States are staggering, but they're just a fraction of those that have been impacted. We are seeing economic results of this. The Dow has seen a huge drop in the last couple of months. Even recent rebounds are just a drop really in the bucket of what we're going to probably see in the coming months and even years as the economy and the world kind of settles out from the impacts of this pandemic. And as you know, many of our colleagues and people that we know personally have begun to be affected in very serious and personal ways because of the economic situation, not just in the US, but even around the world. And so we're expecting that things are going to be tough for quite a while. Even when the immediacy of the current situation settles down, I'm sure that we're going to be feeling the impacts for months and years to come. And so if we were to look at the situation as just merely a stay-at-home period of time while we let the worst of the pandemic pass, the reality is that the impacts of it are going to last for some time. And so just sticking our head in the sand might be kind of difficult to do. So the first question we wanted to dive into is, can we, should we, why should we continue some of the critical organization design and transformation work that organizations may have been teeing up prior to the pandemic that may have now even surfaced because of the pandemic, or that are likely to be, confronting their organizations in the coming months? Well, I think first we should consider there are some key strategic questions that organizations ought to be asking themselves, whether it's now or later. We might argue that now is as good a time as any to begin to ask these questions. But the first one is, where do we want to be after the crisis has passed? Secondly, what differentiated strategy would help us achieve our goals? Now, for those of you who are familiar with AlignOrg solutions, a few years ago, we wrote a book called Mastering the Cube. And in that book, we introduced our cube model of organization alignment. And in that, we kind of used the metaphor of a Rubik's Cube to suggest that organizations operate much like a Rubik's Cube. They're multidimensional, and they have a lot of different things that all have to be aligned to achieve an organization's strategy. Now, in this particular rendition of the cube, you'll notice that the center tile on each side of the cube is highlighted with the word strategy. And that's because when you work with an actual Rubik's Cube and you turn the different sides of it, the center tile on each side is stationary. It stays in the same place, similar to the way a strategy should guide how an organization should stay stable and anchored to its purpose and direction. Now, when we enter times of crisis, organizations need to be more focused, it's our belief, around what's going to set their strategy apart. We've had so many options for so long where the economy has been reasonably good around the world that we can sort of get away with, I'm going to call it mediocrity around our strategy. Now that people are going to be confronted with more scarce resources and fewer options perhaps, you're going to have to be better. And you're going to have to be really focused around what differentiates you. And so the second question that organizations really ought to be asking themselves is, when we come out of the crisis and a consumer or a buyer is faced with a myriad of choices, what's going to cause them to want to choose to spend their limited time, limited resources on us or with us? That's the purpose and power of a differentiated strategy. Now, once we know that, we can then begin to ask ourselves the third key question: what tough choices do we need to make now so we can accelerate our path to recovery or to long-term marketplace success? You'll notice in this view of the cube, you'll see the other sides of the cube represented. The strategy is still there as the anchor, but now we're saying, how do we adjust the way we work? What new structures or alternative structures do we need to be considering? Do our metrics need to adjust? How about our talent and reward systems? Do we need to have new improvement methods? And finally, how does our culture and leadership evolve to adapt to the new reality? I think we're all starting to hear stories of how organizations intend to change the way they work. I imagine that's going to trickle through our lives in many ways that we can't even foresee right now. But as a leader, we ought to be now thinking about how will some of these things need to evolve so that we can come out of the crisis, if you will, in a place to not only recover, but also to potentially lead and be a marketplace leader. And the final question is, how do our organization choices need to be realigned to focus our resources and deliver a differentiated outcome? I've kind of already touched on this one, but for me, this really centers around the idea of resources. Whenever we reach times or periods when resources are scarce, we have to be more focused. We have to be more thoughtful. We have to be more willing to make trade-offs. And that's the purpose in what we do. Now, the next topic that we wanted to kind of touch on is this issue of organization design. All of us kind of know what this is, and we probably even have our own definitions of it. But whenever we go and try to tackle organization design, it's not just the answer that's important. It's important for us to leverage the thinking of our team. It's important for us to make sure that we're taking into account the true outside-in marketplace realities. And finally, it's important to make sure that we're thinking carefully, as I already mentioned, about the resources that we have at our disposal. Now, I'll say a little bit more about the resources. Normally, we would get together in a conference room with some whiteboards or flip charts and a lot of Post-it notes, and we would do strategic organization design work. That's how I've done it through my entire career until about 2 months ago when the world changed and we were forced to move to a virtual setting. In that setting, me for one thought, wow, we're going to be really limited in what we can do and accomplish. But the reality is we found that there are some extraordinarily powerful tools and templates that we can use that have allowed us to continue forward when having some of these discussions, which means that even though the setting is not optimal, and one day I hope we can get back into conference rooms and look each other eye to eye and have meaningful and powerful conversations about the direction of the companies that we work in. In the meantime, we can do some of this virtually, and that's what we mean at this stage in terms of optimizing our resources.